Welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited to have back Dr. Joseph Bobrow. Joseph, welcome.
Good to be here.
Thank you. So Dr. Bobrow practices psychotherapy and psychoanalysis and is the author of 3 books. His approach is informed by years of practicing and teaching Zen mindfulness. He lives and practices in Studio City, California, and consults and teaches widely on psychotherapy, Buddhism, and how they enrich each other in transforming suffering. Joseph is also the founding director and Roshi of Deep Streams Zen Institute, which offers Zen practice, interdisciplinary education, and community service. He's long been bringing together the best from Buddhist and psychodynamic traditions in his work to alleviate individual and collective anguish. Most recently, he developed integrative retreats for military vets and their families and care providers that help heal the unseen wounds of war. Dr. Bobrow, welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be with you, Guy.
Thanks. Always excited to have you back here. Your directness, your openness, your obvious intellect and wisdom, and your presence is just so refreshing, and it's what I hope this podcast is all about, and it's why I love having you back here. So, you had mentioned, we kind of got in touch, and the Dalai Lama's presence in the news was kind of a big issue for what seemed really like a blip. It didn't seem to get a lot of airplay, but it got some. So we were going to talk about that. How did this land for you? What came up?
Well, what came up for me was that something was amiss, and we needed to understand it better, and that we needed to investigate and help clarify what had happened. And I went on social media and made that request to spiritual teachers who happened to be in my feed. And
Can I just interrupt? Can you just briefly give our listeners some context for those who are like, what are we talking about here? Because some people might not be aware of what happened.
There was an interaction the Dalai Lama had with a young Indian boy where there was some concern that there had been some sexualized, inappropriate conduct on the Dalai Lama's part in some quarters, and in other quarters it's fierce defending of the Dalai Lama. The boy seemed quite uncomfortable during the interaction. Dalai Lama kind of drew the boy to him in a way that the boy drew away from. Dalai Lama drew him close to him again. They touched heads. Dalai Lama stuck out his tongue, which is apparently a form of communication in some parts of Tibetan culture, a kind of a greeting. And then the Dalai Lama asked the boy to suck his tongue, which the boy did not do, but did their heads touch. And in the full video afterward, the family seemed happy and the boy seemed happy, and everything seemed fine. So that's, I think, a fairly objective statement of what had happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So what's your reflection on what occurred?
Well, I just want to tell the story, then I'll tell you my reflection and what issues it brought up for me, which actually are issues that I deal with in book number 4, which is called A True Person of No Rank, Awakening Buddha's Dream to Save the World. And maybe I could get into some of that as we go on. So here's just a little bit of narrative. I put it out on social media in a very non-judgmental way, just that, some things seemed amiss, and could some of the well-known and highly skilled colleagues of mine who were on, say, Instagram, but could we come together and talk things over, share perspectives, and so on? And I was only able to do that with one of them privately. There didn't seem to be a lot of interest in an objective examination of what had happened, what the potential meaning of it, the ramifications of it. And I was very disappointed. So I continued to post a couple of times and to dialogue with this colleague of mine, who finally said that she wasn't going to die on that mountain, the mountain of raising concerns, validating concerns about the Dalai Lama's conduct. So that was a dead end. Then I saw probably the most popular spiritual teacher in America, if not in the Western world, post something in which he completely defended the Dalai Lama and basically said there's no reason to be concerned.
Was that Thurman?
Yeah, I don't want to get into names. I'm sorry. That wasn't Thurman, but I just don't want to get into names.
Okay.
But clearly one of the most respected people who's also a therapist, and basically was implying it's much ado about nothing, and the Dalai Lama is pure, and I can vouch for that. Now this was very troubling to me because it elided what I was asking for, which was an open consideration of the fact that something did not feel right about that interaction to many people, to most people. Then what happened was that same person with 3 or 4 of their friends, who all of them are the cream of the crop of American Buddhism, and all of whom were therapists and knowledgeable about trauma, came out with exactly the same message. We know His Holiness. He would never do anything to harm this boy. It's just a silly, kind of funny interaction. And plus, the way that the video was released, it was probably done by the Chinese to get over on the Dalai Lama. Now, when I saw this, I was really shocked and disappointed that these people would take this kind of tack and not validate just the observation that this boy seemed uncomfortable. Just that, and would say, well, if you looked at the whole video, then you would see that everyone ended up happy, completely avoiding the pressure that the boy might have felt to laugh and go along with someone of great spiritual stature. So where this leads me is a number of different places that I could go. But I want to start with Kohut talked about self-objects and how we all need people who we can revere, who we can look up to. And I think we need such beings for all our lives, no matter who we are. We know that we stand on the shoulders of others who we respect and admire and love. And clearly the Dalai Lama represents that for many people, including these teachers I was referring to, and other researchers and teachers who've interacted with him through the years. However, I think that it is potentially traumatic to recognize the humanity of our self-objects and to let in disappointment about their conduct. And so it doesn't happen. And so our spiritual teachers, sometimes our therapists or our other teachers or whoever we hold in this role for us, become idealized. And this permits a lot of damage to go on. So that's where I'd like to start the discussion. And again, I talk about this in this fourth book about how sometimes we're the last people to know the impacts of our actions. We have examined ourselves. In fact, I'll share with you an interaction with the Dalai Lama earlier about this very thing, but just to start out with the point that experts, therapists, analysts, spiritual teachers often think that we're not subject to the same blind spots that ordinary humanity is. And we won't say that, but somewhere it's part of our self-concept, maybe just beneath the surface. And what I talk about in the fourth book is the importance of tracking the traces of the impacts that our conduct has. Our conduct has impacts, many of which we're not aware of. So if we're not aware of them, if there is such a thing as the unconscious, which is a big point I make in the book too, how I think the unconscious needs to be woven into this, then if we acknowledge that we're often the last to know the impacts of our conduct, then we should want to ask and follow up. And when someone comes to us and raises an issue, we shouldn't brush them away. We should say, well, please, you may be the prophet. You may be seeing things I missed. So I want to hear from you. I want to weave that in, because I want to maximize the beneficial impacts of my conduct. And if they've not been beneficial, I want to know. So I was very troubled that people, not only of stature, but of wisdom and intelligence and experience, would not even raise the possibility that there was something amiss, and would subtly convey that there might have been something wrong with the people who were reading stuff into it, and an American kind of anxiety about sexual abuse, a kind of what was COVID, a kind of pandemic of worry about sexual abuse. It's the American puritanical culture, which is reading in, which doesn't understand the Tibetan culture. I mean, these arguments were not only upside down to me, but they were very troubling and filled with denialism. And I am troubled by that.
If I may here, so when this first happened, which was a couple of months ago, it was pretty much all over the news. I remember seeing it, and initially, being really troubled. I mean, it was disturbing. I watched the video, and even that was disturbing. And then I think I saw something online where I think it was, well, I went in and I looked up Robert Thurman, who's a Buddhist scholar. I think he's at Harvard right now, but one of the most well-respected people in the field. And he wrote something kind of extensive on this, which kind of explained it away. In other words, he said that this conduct that was going on with the sucking of the tongues was in fact some practice, ancient practice. And I know I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but I walked away from that reading like, oh, okay, it's not what it looked like. It wasn't as disturbing. This was, in fact, an actual religious / Buddhist practice that goes on. Now, that was my reading of essentially of what he said. Now, are you saying that that's not the case, and maybe that's even denying what's going on?
I'm not an expert in Tibetan culture. I've met the Dalai Lama several times. He wrote the foreword to my book, Waking Up from War. I had something to do with one of his closest colleagues, who was the first president of the country, independent country of Tibet, in Dharamsala. I am very well disposed to the Dalai Lama, and I find Bob Thurman usually very well informed and informative. However, I think I agree with you when you said things get explained away. And even if, which I don't grant, but even if what he said is so, that not only the sticking out of the tongue, but the sucking of the tongue is part and parcel of Tibetan culture and nothing to be concerned about in the slightest. Even if that is so,
right,
there's a whole other culture in the world that would see it and be impacted quite differently.
Mm-hmm.
And the boy with whom he engaged in that clearly didn't know this cultural artifact, because he kept pulling away, and he did not suck the Dalai Lama's tongue.
Mm-hmm.
And he was Indian. He wasn't Tibetan. So at the very least, there was a lack of awareness of the culture of the person he was with and the culture of around the world who are observing this, and the impacts that this had, the ramifications that this had. And at the very least, it would call for a cross-cultural dialogue in which people would engage the Dalai Lama and let him know that even though this may have apparently, allegedly, been part of Tibetan culture, there are other cultural viewpoints about that involve boundary crossings, sexual inappropriateness, and a whole continuum up until sexual abuse. And there could have been at least a mutual learning and a discussion of how it could have come across, not just due to American hysteria, but due to American progress in understanding trauma. For goodness sakes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think your point is well taken. It seems you tried to reach out, and you, for all intents and purposes, you're reaching out, called upon deaf ears. But I think really it remains to be seen. Was this in fact, or were his actions based in fact on some religious practice? And they were based on some religious practice. It's not as bad as it seems. yes, he crossed some cultural boundaries, but
hold on a second, Guy. I have to push back here. Over the years, there have been a lot of religious practices that have been bad for human beings,
right,
and which have been justified by the fact that God told me to do it, or it's part of my religion. So come on now.
right.
I don't know where you were going with it, but I just wanted to catch it in the bud.
No. That's a fair point. I guess what I'm just saying is, after reading Robert Thurman's essay, again, which he seemed to back this on the basis of this was some religious practice, and it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But yeah, you're right. It however you slice and dice it, it's not a good look on the dollar. I mean, it's abusive. Let's call it for what it is. I mean, asking this kid to suck your tongue, come on.
Yeah. So I'm less interested at this point. I'm glad we see eye to eye on that. I would agree with you. But you see, at the same time as this was being processed, a couple of weeks later, a fellow Zen teacher named Grace Pearson was co-leading a workshop on preventing sexual abuse in Buddhist Sanghas, the 6-part series. It was terrific. And in that series, he addressed the problems that I was resonating with. I mean, there are many problems with this, but what concerns me the most, again, is the blind spots and how we are traumatized or afraid of being traumatized by seeing our role models as real people.
Mm-hmm.
And how dangerous this is. Now, I will say something about the Tibetan culture, which I've read about and is backed up by research, and that there was, I can find the reference, I don't have it offhand, but there was a study done over a long period of time, traveling to many Asian countries, including the Tibet and the Tibetan monasteries in India, to explore the phenomenon of abuse of some of the monks throughout Asia. And when this researcher talked about her visit to many Tibetan monasteries, where there are thousands of young boys, and there's a history of not only orphans, but young boys being given over to the monastery and to the training, and this brings merit on the parents. And there have been some accounts of abuse within the monasteries. And this particular researcher met 3 or 4 senior people there who said that there is some problem, but it's not discussed. And basically, I'm not going to discuss it with you, interviewer.
Right.
So there is, in some religious traditions, a worship of the spiritual teacher as a guru who can do no wrong. And the problem is yours. If you're even raising a concern, you must be deluded.
Right.
And Tibetan culture and religion is not the only one, but it's one of the ones where the guru culture is quite strong. And I've heard this many times about teachers who've committed misconduct. It's not what it looked like.
Right.
It's not what it looks like. Well, it's exactly what it looks like, and sometimes worse. So that's the other thing that occurred to me. If the Dalai Lama can be so free to do something that felt out of line, at the very least, if not, to use your word, abusive, then what's being done or what's being countenanced behind the scenes?
Mm-hmm.
We know now that in many Tibetan Sanghas, there's a lot of uprising of Sanghas regarding abuse by teachers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not only in the Catholic Church or the Zen tradition, but in the Tibetan tradition. And there is a little bit of a cultural lag because some people went over a few years ago to try to instruct and raise the Dalai Lama's consciousness about sexual misconduct on the part of some teachers, which he hadn't been calling out. And it took several tries for him to finally come and, in a kind of lukewarm way, say that this is not acceptable. So there's something that we Westerners, Guy, have to bring to this problem of blind spots and sexual abuse in religious traditions. And it has to do with a few things. One is the importance of trauma. Secondly, is the importance of the unconscious transmission of trauma.
Mm.
And the fact that blind spots exist, which means the unconscious exists. And we need others to help us know ourselves. So these are things that we in the West can and must bring to an integrative dialogue about what it means to be a spiritual or psychological authority or healer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very well put. And to your point, if the scholars aren't willing to engage in a dialogue, who is, right? I mean, if the Dalai Lama, you could say, maybe is in some circles, some a spiritual North Star, if he's doing this, what am I to think? What am I to do? If I'm a religious scholar, how am I going to comment on this person, my religious North Star, who's moved off center to such a degree?
Well, you wouldn't even think of commenting on it. That's the problem, right? It wouldn't even occur to you because couldn't be.
Right.
And that's the danger. You wouldn't even let yourself think it.
All right, let's just pause here for a second to thank our sponsors. All right, we are back. This, I'm going to bring up something here that I'm just reminded of, and the situation with Bessel van der Kolk. That occurred, there was a couple of years ago. I think there was some people with whom he'd been working said he was verbally abusive and bullying. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but it was, I think it got him fired from a particular place of employment, but it's something that people in the field don't talk about. Again, it's a similar situation.
Yes.
But what are you proposing here?
I'm proposing an integrative ideal of the enlightened or awakened person. That's what I'm proposing. Nothing short of that. Because clearly, people like the Dalai Lama, let's just stick with him, or Zen teachers who have jumped through all the hoops and been checked by all the senior teachers, and their Kento, their Satori, their awakening has been approved and they've been authorized. And it turns out that some of them do harmful things. So even having the kind of experiential knowledge and teaching ability that Bessel van der Kolk has, there's still a matter of his character, which may not get changed by all his learning. And what I've been learning over the years and been writing about, especially in my first book and the fourth book, the latest one, is that very fact, that this conundrum, that how is it that insight, direct insight into the sacredness of and interconnection of all life, which was thought to completely transform the individual and assure that their conduct would be irreproachable, how is it that that paradigm doesn't work? What's missing? And what's missing is what I'm trying to talk about. What's missing is an understanding that, and I'm not with those people who throw out the baby with the bathwater. There are some Zen teachers who say, you've made such a fuss about enlightenment now that we'll just dispense with it. What matters is your embodiment of the teachings. Are you a good person? Is the karma you're sponsoring benevolent? Are you helpful? Or are you a bully? Or are you an abuser? Or, something like that. So it's a fair point, but I don't like to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because I think the experience of awakening or the experience of healing in the psychotherapy setting, these are real things. Right. And they do change things about us, but they need something else. And that something else has to do with, see, you know this, Guy, but so I'm preaching to the choir with you, but our audience is wider than just you and me. I know that. That's great. Is that we know about emotional regulation, but we don't know about unconscious emotional regulation, interactive emotional regulation, as talked about, say, by Shore. We don't know about unconscious emotional communication, how we can think we're coming across one way, but we're really coming across the other way. So what happens is that, and I was just looking at a summary of my book, what happens is our insight and embodiment of that insight, our realization and our personalization of that insight go in and out of alignment. Sometimes they're in alignment, and sometimes they're not. And when they're not, if we don't know that they're out of alignment, then sometimes we end up acting in ways that are contrary, not only to the teachings, but to our own insight about the way life is, life and death are, what's reality, what's the mind, and all those things. So I've been making a case for the embodiment of our healing insights, of our transformative spiritual insights, and adding something which can counter this kind of lost in translation phenomena, that somewhere between prajna, between insight, and sila, which is the embodiment of the precepts or goodness and insight, somewhere in there, something gets lost in translation. And I'm proposing a more integrative view where we don't just do conscious practices, but we're aware of the unconscious in four different ways. One is as a communication, that emotions are being communicated unconsciously in what Adam Phillips called the black market of emotions. So we have to be open to that level of communication. The second is that our motivations are not always what we think they are. And plus the road to hell is lined with good intentions, but they're conscious intentions. Most motivation is unconscious. The third is that emotional regulation is one thing. Having conscious awareness of our emotions is one thing, but there is such a thing, as Shore says again, called interactive regulation, which happens beneath the surface of consciousness, where we're helping regulate one another's arousal levels, anxiety, and if we're with that and of that, then we know it can be a good thing, but there can also be unconscious emotional dysregulation, right? And we can be doing something differently than we think we're doing. And then the fourth unconscious element is the unconscious transmission of trauma. that we're being assailed by bits and residues of trauma picked up usually through our bodies as we're coming to know, but not organized in a coherent, conscious way, so that trauma is transmitted not only intergenerationally, but within ourselves, is transmitted from our early experience unconsciously. And if we're unconscious of that trauma, we will act it out, most likely, thinking that we're doing good. So I have been advocating the continuing education of the spiritual teacher and the therapist to include these elements so we can shine a light on what gets lost in translation, we can prevent harm, and we can increase the chances of benevolent impacts.
Wow. This topic, unconscious transmission of trauma, brings up a lot for me. And so you're saying, are you covering this in your fourth book?
Yeah.
You said, give our listeners the name of that book.
Okay. I was trying to find a copy. There's got kind of a nice cover on it.
Is that Zen and Psychotherapy?
No, that was my first book. That was 2010.
Oh, is it a true person of no rank?
Yes.
Okay. True person of no rank, awakening Buddha's dream to save the world.
That's right. Awakening Buddha's dream. That's to say, it's just a dream. It was Buddha's dream. It was reflected in his teachings and in his conduct. But it's up to each of us to awaken that dream through our own embodiment.
This is really interesting to me, this topic, and it's interesting, Joseph, because I don't think I've really talked about it, surprisingly or not, on this podcast. But you, obviously, with your somewhat unique background, seem to be the person to bring it into the light. How, obviously, in addition to the book, are you doing this in other ways? Are you trying to continue discussions with people? You mentioned you were reaching out on Instagram and so forth.
Yeah, I just let the book do the talking at this point. I mentioned Grace Shearson, who I think is absolutely terrific on this stuff, and who knows, maybe at some point he and I will do some teaching together. I have been teaching. I've been speaking about my book at various locations where I'm invited, and sort of expanding the paradigm of what awakening is, what the awakened person is, and how we can join our insight and our embodiment and make use of our character rather than have our character be our affliction because it's unconscious. So I've been talking to different groups. I've been talking to groups of psychotherapists about the meditative dimension of psychotherapy, where two people are sitting in the room, mind, body, soul, and they are kind of, I'll just use the word, they're kind of vibing together. They're thinking together, they're talking together, they're observing each other, they're listening to each other, and they're communicating consciously and unconsciously. And in that process, which I call a meditation à deux, a two-person meditation, stuff arises that neither one can predict. And the analyst Bion called that the emotional truth. So it's not necessarily what you say or how you say it, but it's this deeper emotional truth might float up if the conditions are right. if both people are collaborating in this meditative way. So I try to share that with analysts. But in terms of the ethical questions and I haven't really done much with it lately, but I agreed to talk with you, Guy, because I trust you, and I knew that I would be able to share this idea, this core idea today, which is that I think what keeps the people I've been talking about from opening up to the possibility that there was a transgression and to doing an investigation of that and a mutual elucidation of that, not in a kangaroo court kind of way, not presuming anything, but in a very open-minded way where we both can learn something from that. What keeps these people doing it is a very rigid self-object structure where their beloved objects can do no wrong. And that is terribly dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, one famous person in this group, would frequently say it's going to cast a bad light on Buddhism.
Right.
And I think the opposite is true, that not raising it casts a bad light on Buddhism, just like not raising it in the Catholic Church casts a terrible light on Catholicism. They're losing so many people.
Right. And not only does it cast a bad light, but it allows it to fester.
To fester unaddressed.
Right.
Unaddressed and to grow.
Right. Right. Joseph, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Probably through my website, josephbobrow.com, or the website of our Zen group, Deep Streams Institute, which is deepstreams.org.
Okay, and we'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. The book is called A True Person of No Rank, Awakening Buddha's Dream to Save the World. Always enlightening, if I can use that word, to have you on here. It's a pleasure, and I'd love to have you back as always. Thank you so much, Joseph.
Thank you, Guy. I always feel so unencumbered and so open, and your openness, I think, always makes for a really vibrant exchange. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. I appreciate that. Take care.
You too.